Before we get started, how many of you are pretty familiar with Dallas Willard? And so you've read 2 or 3 or more of his books. Okay. How many of you, this will be the first time you've heard much about Dallas Willard? Okay, all right. I'll try to disappoint both groups. First, thank you very much, Jeffrey, for the kind introduction, for the opportunity, and for getting to talk about one of my favorite topics. So this is our subject as a little boy, as a Ricky Nelson-looking student at Tennessee Temple, and then later in life. Since I thought some of you might not have been intimately familiar with Dallas, I thought I'd begin with just some bigger picture stuff before we get into the biography. So who is Dallas Willard? Personally, someone I miss very much. My wife and I drove across the country to work with the Willard Center. We didn't know Dallas was going to die a couple of years later. It was an incredible opportunity. It's someone I miss. At one of his memorial services, the dean of the School of Philosophy at USC said that basically Dallas is that professor of lore that everyone hopes exists, but no student really thinks does exist. But he did. And also, for me, he was more of that Christian of lore. I mean, someone, I know it's going to sound over the top, but someone like a St. Francis or someone who just, you get the feeling that they're, as John Ortberg said, lives in a different zip code than some of the rest of us. He's someone who lived in the kingdom of God here on earth in such a way it caused thousands of others to think that Jesus knew what he was talking about. In that sense, it reminds me of the quote from Seraphim of Serav, who said, let one person find true peace and 1,000 will find their salvation. For Willard, formation, being like Jesus, was more something that was caught than taught. You saw it in his person. I missed that. He was someone who began life as a farm boy from rural Missouri. I like that. I'm from rural Georgia. Brought up in a very conservative theological tradition. Became a Southern Baptist minister. He went to Tennessee Temple. I don't know if anybody knows Tennessee Temple. If you're from Bob Jones, you say that's where the conservative Christians go. When the Willards were at Tennessee Temple, it was a thriving, going concern. It was exploding in growth. It was very revivalistic. The students said that the green light on campus means go, preach the gospel. Dallas was ordained on December the 2nd, 1956, Thomasville Baptist Church, Thomasville, Missouri. He died an ordained Southern Baptist minister. He was also a respected academic philosopher. Undergraduate degrees in philosophy from Baylor, Ph.D. from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and taught philosophy at the University of Southern California for 46 years. A few of those years he was chair of the department. He was someone who has been called, this is for Bill Lewis, America's answer to Bill Smith, America's answer to C.S. Lewis. Sorry, I think you so much alike that it happens. By that I mean, he was a respected academic. That was a pretty good recovery. Anyway, more known for his religious writing than his academic writing, but he was very respected in the academic side of things. And I'm going to give you an example of one of his books. Of course, Lewis has a famous book with many others. So does Dallas, but just one of the ones that sort of put him on the map, a book he wrote called The Divine Conspiracy. Let's listen to this. Richard Foster, more on Richard later, was struck by this book. He called it, in referring to the comprehensive nature of the divine conspiracy, he said, it provides a conceptual philosophy for understanding the meaning and purpose of human existence. It's pretty sweeping. Willard, in thinking about the book and describing the book, he said, it is my hope with this book to provide an understanding of the gospel that will open the way for people to actually do what Christ once did and to acknowledge what their maestro said could be done. The reason in this slide I have a gavel, I think one of Willard's contributions was he put the concept of salvation back in a hospital. In addition to being in a courtroom, in a hospital, salvation as healing. Someone who has been called, now, let's not get carried away, but I think you could make a small case for Dallas Willard being a reformer, almost in the vein of a Luther. I know that sounds over the top. Let me try to mildly convince you. For 27 years, Dallas taught in the Doctor of Ministry program at Fuller, a 12-hour seminar every summer. He'd have about 30 students, sometimes more, sometimes a few less, 27 summers. He did this just for fun in the summer and because of his love for ministry. I sat in on 3 of these. We filmed one of them, and here's the way it would often go. Dallas would basically say, and I'm paraphrasing, there's a good chance everything that you've thought about salvation is wrong. Let me explain it to you. Now, in this class, there will be at least 15 different denominations represented on average across an entire spectrum, from conservative to liberal. And virtually every year, after 2 weeks, the class ended in a similar way. He would get a standing ovation. Now, if you can pull that off, that is pretty spectacular. And to get Dallas, I think you have to look a bit at how he redefined or how he at least amplified some definitions of some very common words. Salvation. He would say salvation is eternal life. Salvation is knowing God. Dallas liked to remind people that Jesus only defined eternal living one time in the entire New Testament, and that's found in John 17:3. To know the Father and the Son whom he sent, Holy Spirit implied. Salvation, stepping into an interactive, transforming friendship with the Trinity here and now. About heaven, he would say it's not a pleasure factory. Heaven is eternal living. He liked to say, you want to go to heaven? Go now. Step into that way of living here and now. And it's a place where it will be very difficult to avoid God. Hence, our God view is very important. A faulty God view, a view of God that we want to run from, and John 17:3 is just not going to happen. We look for ways to more control this God as opposed to be with him. He liked to rephrase the Lord's Prayer and remind us that you could say rightfully, Our Father who is everywhere. Our Father who is as near to us as the air that we're breathing. Sin is to be on a path that leads to and continues a path away from God. Movement away from union with God is a disease of the soul. Simply managing sin does not lead to the abundant life Jesus promised. Yes, sin is from the Greek word hamartia. It's missing the mark. What is the ultimate mark? Willard would say the ultimate mark was Paul's number one teaching point. Christ in you, the hope of glory. That the ultimate mark is union with God. We talk about the gospel this way. The gospel is the good news of the presence and availability of the kingdom here and now and forever through reliance on Jesus. Dallas grew up on a farm in rural Missouri. He remembers when the REA brought electricity to the farm, and he remembers that he was delivered to the barn so the cows could be milked first. He was still reading Plato by candlelight until late in his high school career by the fireplace. Eventually it got to the house, and he would like to say, hey, when Jesus says, the kingdom of heaven is at hand, he would probably say it the same way as if he were to say, hey, electricity is at hand. Flip on the switch. It's here. Enjoy it. This is a drawing I don't know if people know of Roberta Bondi, emeritus professor at Emory, expert on the church of the first few centuries. She has this circle as a way of reminding people that when you move, that to me this captures Willard and sin and salvation. That sin is the movement away from union. The journey of salvation is a movement toward union. Sounds pretty classic Christianity, first few centuries. And that when we move toward God, if the perimeter, the circumference represents perimeter, sorry. All the people that we're with, as we move toward union with God, we're bringing our friends with us. Bondi, an expert on desert spirituality, in her book, To Love as God Loves, reminds that the desert dwellers were interested in three primary things: developing a life that promotes trust, humility, and love. One of Willard's books, published posthumously, Life Without Lack, the three central chapters are trust, humility, love. I think I can't do much with getting Willard across without emphasizing, for a lot of people, he really put a new light on something as basic as salvation itself. I'd like to read a little something to you. This is another book that I wrote, but to prove that I'm not trying to sell books, I won't even tell you the title, but I do want to share a story from it. And it is a book about unpacking Willard. Two visions of salvation, two stories. In the first story, God creates two naked people without belly buttons, places them in a garden. It's not clear why he does this, but there's some good news. They're naked. I may have mentioned that already. And their primary job is to be fruitful and to multiply. One day, while taking a break from the multiplying and naming the animals, the woman, influenced by a talking snake, tricks the man into taking a bite out of an apple. All hell breaks loose. God is surprised and then becomes extremely angry. He curses them, every dog, cat, rock, leaf, and Chicago Cubs fan. I know this is dated now. The entire universe and each of the 7 billion plus and counting descendants who will follow. Through many millennia, God stews in his wrath. He does write down a few instructions and occasionally sends a plague and prophet or flood to keep folks in line. But mostly he just sits around looking a lot like Charlton Heston, scowls down through the glass bottom floor of heaven as he thinks up new ways for humans to cause humans to behave. Then finally, when he can take it no more, he sends his own son to be tortured and then brutally murdered. While there are a lot of theories about why God's son had to die, the bottom line is it somehow caused God to feel a whole lot better about things and helped him decide that anyone who hears about what Jesus did and says a magic phrase will once again live forever and enjoy paradise. And for those who don't say the incantation, they will burn in flames for all eternity. Don't say the right words and your fate will be a more grotesque horror than could be conjured up by a committee comprised of Nero, Salem witch trial judge, Hitler, and Genghis Khan. I never liked this story. In the second story, God exists as a loving community whose relationship is so joyful and pulsating and vibrant that it has best been described as a dance, perichoresis. God decides that this is all too wonderful to keep to himself. So he creates an entire universe and tenderly places humanity at the center, like the offspring of proud parents brought home to a nursery. Then God does something even more amazing. He plants within the human heart a small but glorious piece of himself. Under his watchful eye, these two creatures are to grow into beings who will become as much like God as possible. They are to join the dance, become partners with the Trinity. But the very first two make a fatal decision. They decide they can live unplugged from the tree of life, John 17:3, the presence and energy of God, and in fact can be God themselves. God is not surprised. He saw this day coming even as he was knitting them together. You can't surprise someone who lives outside the boundaries of time. He does, however, become very sad as separation and the reality of free will play out before his eyes. He sets in motion a series of plans to woo us back home, refusing to give up on his original plan to be a nurturing parent to his precious children, showing them how to grow their character until it mirrors his own. Through the passing millennia, God becomes a prodigal father, standing by his driveway, straining his neck, waiting for his children to come home. He sends cards and letters and patriarchs and prophets with the same message: your inheritance is waiting. The promises can still be cashed. Come home. I want to be with you. I want to teach you to dance. But when it becomes clear that we will not come home for longer than a brief visit, God can't wait any longer. He empties himself of divine dignity and wades into the murk and sits down in the mire alongside his prodigal children, becoming as much like us as possible for a while so that we can learn to be like him forever. Jesus brings the good news that the doors to the kingdom are open wide, that the Trinity still wants us to join the dance, to become as one with them as they are with each other. Homoousios, not homoousios. Anyway, I didn't put that in the book. He inhales death and separation into himself, and he shows through the gruesome image of crucifixion what it looks like to freely die to all that is separate from the will of God. And then he demonstrates through his resurrection that he knows what he's talking about. But that's not all. He sends the Holy Spirit with music and a dance chart so that we can learn how to waltz with the Trinity even now as we wait for the real party to begin. I love that story. It makes sense out of the fact that the only time Jesus defines eternal life, John 17:3, he describes it as entering into a deep, intimate, transforming friendship with members of the Trinity. I don't read that story for theological reasons. I read it for the sake of getting Dallas. To get Dallas, I think you have to start with, he actually believes there's an invisible reality present all around as if it were a fifth, sixth, or seventh dimension. It's here, and you can interact with it. And that salvation is a journey toward union. Salvation is the active participation in John 17:3. And for a lot of people, that was jolting and incredibly life-giving for some. Reading a book once called A Beginner's Introduction to the Philokalia. I don't know how many have heard of the Philokalia, written across 11 centuries from the 4th to the 15th century, 25 different authors, about the soul. So that's a bunch of monks writing about the soul and their experiences with prayer. There's a book. The book is written by Anthony Coniaris, A Beginner's Introduction to the Philokalia. And I thought that was a good place to start. And I was reading it and enjoying it and reading it devotionally, and I was on my 6th time through. And I realized as I read these 20 phrases, each one gets about a 5-page chapter, that somewhere in the margin I'd written, this is where Dallas Willard said this. Here's where Dallas Willard said that. I think there's a real, extremely strong connection between Willard and ancient Christian spirituality. Just that simple. I think when Willard seems kind of jolting and different to some folks, I think there might be just a missing that he's not. Dallas liked to talk about Christianity back when there were just Christians. Christianity before 1054. It wasn't a denominational focus. He was just reminding about drinking from the headwaters of theology. And I think that's one thing that he brings. He brings something else, and I've got 4 slides to try to demonstrate it. He's also known for saying something shocking. It came up at dinner tonight. What if Jesus is really smart? If you ever are in front of a group of people and you just ask them, give me examples of some of the smartest people you ever know, you may be surprised how infrequently Jesus is mentioned, the creator and the designer of the universe. So I did something as a recovering psychologist to help make this point. I took the four foundational philosophical questions and put Jesus' answer alongside a couple of psychologists. The reality question. What is considered to be real? What is reality? B.F. Skinner's answer, the measurable physical universe. Freud's answer, the physical universe including the unseen subconscious mind. Dr. Jesus' answer, God and his kingdom. That is what you can count on. That is what you have to come to terms with. The well-being question, who has it made? Who is well off? Skinner, anyone is able to live with as many pleasant events as possible while living free from physical pain. Freud, the person who is maximally in touch with his or her unconscious and able to live and examine life. Jesus, anyone who is alive in the kingdom. That is, anyone who is interactively engaged with God in the various dynamic dimensions of his reigning. This is eternal life. The character question. Who is a really good person? Skinner, anyone who on a personal and corporate level seeks to minimize pain and maximize pleasure for self and others. Freud, a person who seeks to understand the self and help others do the same. Jesus, anyone who is pervaded by love. And then finally, the developmental question. How does one become a genuinely good person? Skinner's answer, you're shaped by your environment in such a way that you minimize the causes of pain in others. Freud, analysis. Jesus, you place your confidence in Jesus Christ and become his student or apprentice in kingdom living, entering into the abundance of the life that he brings to us. I've come to be convinced, this is Willard talking, that Jesus offers a source of exquisite knowledge that answers life's most important questions, and that his answers deserve at least minimum equal attention to those provided by psychology's pioneers, those that he, Jesus, created from scratch. All right, that's the introduction. Let's take a look at a little bit of a look at the biography. Something surprised me when I got into this. I met Dallas after he was in his early 50s. I read a book, his second major Christian book, The Spirit of the Disciplines. It was given to me and a friend of mine I went through Fuller with, John Ortberg. I'm not mentioning John's name to name drop. I cannot not tell you a number of times that, both Billy Graham and Mother Teresa says, Gary, you got to stop doing that. So that's not what's going on, but never mind. We were given the book. We'd both been through a 6-year program in clinical psychology at Fuller, MDiv, Ph.D., and we read this book the same weekend and we had the same thought. Where was this? This is why we traveled across the country. This focus on the person, this focus on the possibility of authentic change, real change and transformation. And it blew us away, and I think for both of us, we spent the last 3 decades trying to get to know Willard a little bit more. Willard was someone who believed theology should be experienced. Someone known for quips that were kind of released like time bombs that would just stay in your mind and explode later. Someone who probably changed my theology as much as anybody with this one phrase: don't ever, ever, ever let anyone tell you anything bad about God. That got rid of half my theology. Someone who thought that to be a theologian is to pray, and to pray is to be a theologian. I thought I had invented something once. In fact, I started an institute called the Institute of Clinical Theology to tell you what a bad scholar I am. It was later that I determined that had already been done, Frank Lake in England a few decades before. But I was enamored with the idea of why can't theology be applied in clinical settings. I had read literally 2 chapters of The Spirit of the Disciplines. I was sitting in a restaurant, and I was so audacious or whatever that I just sat there drinking coffee and thinking of people I would like to be on a board of clinical theology. Wrote 15 names down. Willard was one, 2 chapters in. I wrote all 15 of these people. 14 of the 15, to my surprise, said yes. The one who said no, I later started a journal with, so I considered a pretty good list of 15 people. Willard comes out, he doesn't know me, he comes to speak at our first conference on clinical theology, and he has me as a friend for life when he stands up in front of the group and says, I think that all theology should be clinical theology. All theology should be applied. All theology should be experiential. Now, I tell you one more brief story before we get into the structure of the biography, and I'll be sensitive to time. Although I noticed that it's an hour behind, so it's only 5 after. So that's good. That's good for me anyway. Not too long ago, I was sitting around. We're from this part of the country. We live not too far from here, but we have a house in the other side of Athens. And my 97-year-old mom lives in the house, and our oldest daughter, one day a week, looks in as kind of a caretaker for my mom during the day. So we were over there talking, and my mom she's very theatrical and dramatic, and I told her once, as she got older and she worried about the possibility of cognitive impairment, dementia. I said, Mom, every day you can quote at least one verse of scriptures. Another day you don't have dementia. So now when I come home, she's got another 50-verse psalm to rattle off to me that she's memorized. But she's talking. I'm in the middle. Here's my mom. Here's Jessie, oldest daughter. And just all of a sudden I'm aware of the generational differences. And so my mom's telling stories as if it was yesterday about her past, growing up in a rural area, very conservative theological denomination, and just everything that she was saying is so different than Jessie's worldview. And I'm sensitive to it. And I'm wondering, what's Jessie thinking? What's she feeling? And my mom gets up to leave the room for a moment. And I say to Jessie, how's this for you? What are you thinking about all this? And she said a phrase that I couldn't stop thinking about. She said, well, I didn't buy a ticket to this circus, but it's good. It's good to know this. The reason I couldn't stop thinking about it, I realized that it kind of accidentally related to the biography. None of us bought a ticket to the circus of our life. None of us bought a ticket to the DNA that is part of who you are. It just was given to you. None of us bought a ticket to the environment that was so shaping in our lives. And none of us said, hey, I would like a ticket too. And that's the culture that we grew up in. There's a sense that the first half of the biography, which is about the first 30 years of Dallas's life, examines these areas of his life that he did not buy a ticket to: nature, nurture, and culture. We enter the tent of our existence, and in one ring, nature performs our unique spirals of DNA passed down through the millennia without our consent. In ring number 2, nurture, our moms and dads and significant others pass on their opinions about the world, what is valuable. Thousands of thoughts are placed in our heads like so many records on a mental jukebox, and we dance to the tunes that we did not select. And in the final ring, there's culture, the larger collection of social structures such as church and neighborhood and worldview for the generation of our birth. For a third time, our lives are shaped, the circus performs, but we didn't buy a ticket. So we start by looking at that part of Dallas's life, the first 30 years, because I didn't get very far into the process where I realized something that won't be a shock to you, but it was a shock to me. I only knew this man as a 50-plus-year-old philosopher who spoke in perfect sentences and precise definitions and seemed to have it all together. And it was quite a shock to me, even as a psychologist, to realize he became that person. In fact, there were a lot of things about his life that were incredibly shocking, incredibly painful. So the first half is about the journey of becoming. I'll say just a little bit about the first ring, nature, as it relates to Dallas. And you. Your DNA contains a record of your ancestors, but you're not a carbon copy of any one of them. Dallas Willard inherited his height, above average, his gender, male, his hair color, brown, eye color, sort of brown, a rich baritone voice. Some geneticists would even say that when Dallas was driving around a curve on 2 wheels as a teenager, he was simply exercising his thrill-seeking gene. If the views of some, it is the views of some who knew him well, if they're correct, he would have scored a 5 on the Enneagram, if that has any meaning to anyone in the room. The investigator who prizes knowledge, understanding, and insight, that pattern too may well have been in his DNA. And most likely, the pancreatic cancer that took his life far too early was also part of the genetic code that he did not write. But there were some aspects of Dallas's nature that he did modify. For example, while he inherited his deep, smooth voice, he certainly honed it through years of leading songs and humming hymns. He also did a lot to increase his remarkable capacity for memory, which he was handed at birth, through years of careful study of the scripture, memorization. And he certainly honed it through years of leading songs and humming hymns. Sorry, I think you got that though. He also did a lot to increase his remarkable capacity for memory. I jumped ahead. So, some important people in Dallas's life. To the far left, his paternal grandparents, Rhoda, Susan Spurlock Willard, his grandfather, Joseph Willard. There's a lot of ecumenism in the home. One was a Baptist, the other was a Methodist. His parents are in the middle, Albert and Mamie Willard. And then here we have the 4 Willard children. This is Dallas here, his oldest brother J.I., his sister Fran, and brother Dwayne, closest to him. Dwayne and Dallas are an interesting study, very briefly. They're 4 years apart, but Dwayne went in the service. So as it turns out, the two had so many shared, in addition to shared DNA, they went to the same high school, they went to the same colleges, Tennessee Temple and then Baylor. They went to the same Ph.D. program, University of Wisconsin. They both became philosophers. They both took jobs in large universities and taught philosophy at the same university for all their life. And late in his life, Dwayne wrote a letter to his brother Dallas and referred to most of the things in the spiritual life that are so important to Dallas as Paul would say, dung. He didn't say it as Paul would say it, but so that also became part of the becoming Dallas Willard. How is this possible? What events in two people's lives sharing the same DNA produce such different paths in some ways? What about you? If we were doing this at more of a retreat, I would leave you about an hour or so in small groups to think about this, but I'll just leave these to float for maybe you think about later. What about you? What about your nature? What are a few elements in your DNA for which you are deeply grateful? Take a moment now to at least recall that. What is one element that has posed challenges to your health, happiness, or spiritual growth? It's just woven into your code. How has your nature, your temperament, learning style, etc., become part of your becoming? So I'm not sure Dallas would ever have wanted a biography to be written on him, about him, unless it was about you. What is there about his life that we can learn from? Nurture. Ring 2. There's a lot of pain in Dallas's life. He lost his mom when he was 2.5 years old. She fell off of a hay wagon, and the family had a medical insurance policy, but it was with a hospital 2.5 hours away, so she had to go 2.5 hours to Topeka from where they lived in Missouri. The surgery was botched. She was in the hospital a couple of weeks. She never came home. When it was clear that she was dying, her last words to Dallas's father were, keep eternity before the eyes of the children. A stepmother entered his life later, and it wasn't a very pretty picture in many ways. The kids were sent away from the home twice. And really, one of the hardest things about the biography to write was that after his mom died, he was with different caretakers almost every year, every other year. So it was just hard to keep up with where is he now and who is he living with. He spent a lot of years with a couple all the way to the right. This is his older brother, J.I., and his wife, Bertha. He was able to spend a lot of time interviewing Bertha. She was 18, Dallas was 4 when he came to live with her. She says, I was so young, he was so young, I didn't raise him, we raised each other. You see in her stories a lot of scars of rejection in Dallas's life. One kind of dramatic story. She comes to the room and he's got his face in his palms and he's looking distraught, and she says, what's wrong? And he says, when the baby comes, you won't want me anymore. It's a deep fear of rejection, of abandonment. He used to, for neighbors, cut wood for extra money, and he would cut it very precisely. He was asked once, why are you taking so much time with that? He says, sometimes if you cut the wood just right, they'll let you stay for a while by the fire. There were dramatic signs of anxiety, some I didn't even feel free to write about in the biography, but it was self-doubt, migraine headaches, anxiety about can I make it in a Ph.D. program. There was a father who didn't protect him, having to deal with that, but there were father substitutes. There was a mother's absence, and there were many mother substitutes in his life. I think one of the key things about the separation anxiety is I think it enlightened for him the healing reality of a God always present who will never leave you. What about your nurture? How has the image of one of your parents or grandparents contributed to forming your image of God? How has your God view, either your most troubling heresy of childhood that's hard to chase away or your most accurate picture of God, how has your God view impacted your desire to live in communion with God? See, for just to give you an example, for 20 years, I would relate my salvation story, and I would tell people about the time that I was 7 years old in a little church in rural Georgia when a salvation specialist was brought in and told incredibly scary stories about the afterlife and the possibility of me becoming a rotisserie item. And I went down to the altar and I went back. I showed my mom my sleeve where I cried. And for 20 years, I said, that's when I got saved. It was not. Those images set my salvation back for a couple of decades. Because, see, the truth is, I'm not saying that God didn't honor the sincere prayer of a 7-year-old. I'm not saying that. I'm saying that if salvation, if eternal living is found in John 17:3, then what I owe to Willard is, my view of God made me want to never be in the same room. I wanted a plan or a contract to make sure that he couldn't hurt me. But it wasn't a view of God that drew me in, that wanted me to be in a participatory, transforming friendship. Are there voices, memories of what a significant person in your life has said about you that continue to play in your mind? If positive, how have you been inspired? If negative, how have you been able to move away from their impact? Culture. Upper left-hand corner is the First Baptist Church in Buffalo, Missouri. Regina and I traveled to Buffalo. We went to the church, found the records, and there is Dallas's name written down as I think a 5-year-old or so on the records at the Buffalo Baptist Church, proving conclusively that once your name is written down on a Southern Baptist church, it is not taken off. No, I'm kidding. I have no idea if that's true. Bottom lower corner, the central figure to the left is Dallas's father, Albert. He's a county tax commissioner, some of the people that work in the office with him. And then this is Dallas on your left and Dwayne at Tennessee Temple. And then finally, this is Boscombe Hall at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Various cultures he was exposed to. Now, Dallas was also exposed to a sports culture. I probably shouldn't do this, but I can't help it. This isn't the best research. You could have some faults in what I'm about to show you, but I think this is some speculation about Dallas Willard as a trash talker when he was playing basketball at the University at Tennessee Temple. Some things that overheard Dallas on the court. And your will ends here, he liked to say to those that were guarding him. You are a ceasing spiritual being. You are not perfectly safe in my universe. Exegete this. Indirection. You call that indirection? Let me posterize you with some indirection. These are supposedly funnier if you know a little bit more about Dallas. Sorry. all the disciplines in the world ain't going to help you now, sucker. Get your Reformed theology out of my face. That's probably not fair. In fact, I'd like to say that Dallas, in the Redefining Institute, required all the students to read Calvin's Golden Booklet. Hey, want to know the etymology of your name? You're so stupid you thought the Beatitudes were virtues? Hey, Ref, how long are you going to let this bum camp out in my kingdom? Some of that stuff might not have happened. But the point is, culture. Southern Baptist culture, rural Mid-American culture, revivalistic traditions, liberal university, academic culture. I think Dallas, a lot of the cultural things in Dallas' life, I think, became like a string attached to a kite, and his high view of Scripture. Some of the things that were settled in his mind, I think, was a wonderful grounding that allowed him to kind of let the kite out a little bit in some other areas. What about you? What do you carry from the early years of your church life experiences that continue to shape your spiritual formation? Is there a generational voice that has played a role in your formation? And what is your life telling you right now about your deepest desires? Now, that's the first half of the book, really. The first 30 years of Dallas's life. Now, but here's to where we move after that. I was struck by something after Dallas died. He had 3 memorial services. And I went to each of them, and one of them, it was a fairly small gathering, 150 family, close friends, and so forth. It was very powerful. A little bit later, there was one in a large church sanctuary, a couple thousand people, I guess. And then, in some ways, the one that was the most moving was at the University of Southern California, and people that knew him more in the academic arena. I think that I probably had more tears at that one. But it struck me. This man's living 3 parallel lives. People at USC that knew him as an academic philosopher who probably never heard of Richard Foster, never heard of the book Celebration of Discipline, may not have could tell you any of the titles of Dallas's Christian publications. And there were people in the ministry of his life, primarily Redefining, who I'm quite sure wouldn't be able to tell you who Edmund Husserl was or what phenomenology is. And then there was that intimate circle of family and friends. And so after we get Dallas to age 30, Ph.D., they moved to Southern California. I think it came up a little bit earlier. Dallas had 2 major job offers after he finished at University of Wisconsin. One was at USC. The other was at the University of Georgia. It's history now. You know that he made the wrong choice. But God works in our lives even so. Before he made that decision, though, he had finished his PhD. He was doing a postdoctoral fellowship teaching at the University of Wisconsin, but he was also pastoring 2 churches, 2 congregational churches in rural Wisconsin. One of them was in Arena. We went to the church. We talked to people who were on the committee that brought him in as a pastor. And he's really torn. Which way to go? He has a pastor's heart. He's pastored beginning on sidewalks in Chattanooga, Tennessee. And so he and Jane were having dinner, and Earl Aldridge was a professor at University of Wisconsin and said something that rang true in Dallas's spirit. Which path to take? Earl said something like, that's easy. If you go to the church, you'll lose the university. If you go to the university, you get the university and the church. And that's what he did. So we look at the next 20 years of his life from the perspective of Dallas at work. I'll say just a little bit about this. He was at this is his office at USC. He's obviously a professor. That's Dallas out in front at Mudd Hall. 46 years he was there. I think it's just 3 years he was chair of the department. He was both highly respected as a person, and also there's a sense that they didn't know what to do with him fully because he had 2 strikes against him. He was a Christian. and he was a continental philosopher at a time that analytic philosophy was sort of taking over. About the best I can relate to that as a psychologist, I guess, would be something like if you were a Freudian at the time in the 70s or so, when more empirical approaches and cognitive and behavioral notions are taking over. But he was a loner for, I don't mean a loner. I meant a loner in the sense of you don't know what to do with him. His personality was magnetic. He wasn't a loner in that sense. His first office at USC was under the stairwell. Makes you think of the movie Harry Potter. I mean, it's that he, for almost 2 decades, is literally under the stairs in a small little office at USC. Early in his career at USC, some people it took him a while to get all the preacher out of his lectures. So sometimes students might have a tendency to say amen or something, but eventually some of the people got to him and said, you can't do this. And he got very good at not doing that and still being a Christian. I'll tell you one story. He had a student's name was Brandon Paradise, wonderful name. Student was agnostic, maybe even atheistic. He had to take a philosophy course. He signed up for Dallas's course. He sits in the course for 15 weeks of the semester. As Brandon tells it, Dallas never mentioned God, Jesus, or the Bible. But at the end of the 15 weeks, Brandon was a believer. He later went to Yale Law School. He later became a professor at Rutgers, professor of law. He went to the 2-year Redefining Institute, dedicated to Dallas's thinking and ideas. And he was recently named a full professor, and it's not an endowed chair, but he got to name his professorship. So he is a Dallas Willard professor of law at Rutgers University. Dallas was a powerful evangelist through osmosis. Also through words, but largely when he had to, through osmosis. He was also just known as a professor that students loved. A student who went on to be a professor of philosophy in his life was going through a horrific divorce. He goes to Dallas. Dallas can see he's in pain. Dallas cancels a day, basically, and walks for 7 or 8 hours in the rose garden outside of Mudd Hall talking to him. It's incredible compassion. Family. I think Dallas was probably a lot like you and me, with a lot of the familiar ups and downs of life. To go through what he went through in terms of the nurture environment, the absence, some of the insecurities. Yeah, he didn't get off scot-free with that. His words, 2 sets of his words. First word, he learned to say this: you want to know where God lives? Where's God's address? Easy. endofyourrope.com. And he got to the end of his rope in his early 50s. I do believe I discovered that a lot of things that Dallas is saying and writing has a hinge of autobiography in them, even though he doesn't always say that. This time he does. In his words, in my case, I have to go back and accept the sufficiency of God for all the times when I was left alone. I didn't have parents in the ordinary sense. And thank God others came in to make that up for me. But still, there's something there that is very sore and very bad. And I have to accept that the sufficiency of God, I have to accept the sufficiency of God for that. And I have to look up into the face of God and say, Lord, it's all right. And hear him say, it's all right. It's okay. I've got you. I have you. All is not lost. In fact, I can even take that and make something better. It was largely in the laboratory of family life that Dallas came to do his part, giving up, and so did God. Ministry, just a few words. Dallas had 3 or more offices. This became painfully important to me because his books and papers went to Westmont College, so we had to move 3 offices. He had a USC office, you saw a little bit of it. He had a living room in his house, was a big office. And he had an entire house with a second house on the property with books like this. This is Dallas and Richard. We filmed some things with Dallas and Richard teaching small group curriculum. It's taken from that. And this is, to the far left, is Trevor Hudson, a good friend, his wife Debbie. Trevor, Methodist minister from South Africa. Trevor did a little jail time with Desmond Tutu fighting against apartheid. Trevor's 30 years old or so. He's got the mumps. Someone puts a cassette tape in his hand, and it's Dallas teaching. Trevor listens to some of it and writes a letter. Says, Dallas, come to South Africa. You don't know me. We can't pay you anything. You would have to sleep in the sewing room at our house, but I'll try to gather a few ministers to listen to you teach for a while. So, of course, Dallas said, yes. How could he refuse an offer like that? Flew to South Africa. Trevor recorded all this, so we have all these tapes in the collection at the Willard Center. And he came back, and he came back, and he came back, and they became very good friends. And Trevor, we identified to be the person we wanted to teach in the Redefining Institute after Dallas was no longer able to teach. And I think everybody will understand the spirit with which I'm saying this. Course reviews actually went up when Trevor started teaching, because everybody could understand. No, I'm kidding. They went up in the sense of from 99.9 to 100. In ministry, there are many things that stand out concerning Dallas's approach to ministry. I'll limit just to a few observations. He took his own admonition to heart. He did not seek to speak, but instead sought to have something to say. That's a famous Dallas quote. Don't seek to speak, seek to have something to say. Don't seek to write, seek to have something to write about. Dallas never set out or sat down at a table to intentionally write a Christian book. He taught Sunday school. Word got out. Editors came. Can we tape that? Can we record that? Can we publish that? And then he would go to work on refining that, sometimes 20 versions, but he didn't say, I'm going to write this book. He sought to have something to say. Dallas valued each person to whom he was speaking as if he or she were Jesus. It did not matter to him whether he was in conversation with a young minister with a doctorate from Fuller, like Richard Foster, for instance, or a middle-aged construction worker with a third-grade education, like someone I talk about in the book. Dallas would invest in you as if you were, as if you had the glow of Tabor about you. Dallas valued doing the work of ministry perhaps even more than teaching about theological concepts. He agreed to be on the ministry team of Redefining, but only as long as the team was doing the work of ministry themselves. And most significantly, although he had many opportunities, he never once attempted to cut off Richard Foster's ponytail. Now, we're almost done here. But it's only 7:30. No, just kidding. I know better. This wasn't a deathbed situation, but it could have been. In Dallas's last year of life, he invites one of his 31 Ph.D. students over, J.P. Moreland, for a conversation. He's facing a Whipple procedure, incredibly difficult surgery for pancreatic cancer. And he says to J.P., basically, it was something of a mantle passing. He was saying, these are the most important ideas in my life. And when I heard these ideas, all of a sudden it sort of unlocked Dallas's career, because he never wrote a book that wasn't connected to one of these. I have 3 listed here. You'll see why I'm saying 4 in just a moment. He said to JP, I have a concern for a robust metaphysical realism. See, I'm not like you. I'm not I'm not as smart as you are. So I don't fully know what that means the first time I heard it. So I'd say, please, English. So the English translation to a non-philosopher. He was concerned with the belief that even invisible things like the Trinity, like the kingdom of God, are as much a part of reality as tables and chairs. And he wrote The Divine Conspiracy. He had a concern for epistemic realism. Translation, please. Not only are these things real, you can learn from them. You can step into that reality. You can interact with that reality, and it can shape and create new habit patterns in your body. And he wrote The Spirit of the Disciplines and Hearing God. And he said to JP, I have a third concern, and that is for an anthropology of the person that's comprehensive, An anthropology of the person that includes the invisible parts, like spirit and soul and mind. He wrote Renovation of the Heart. And his fourth concern was, and it's the most important in some ways because it's the proof. He says, if these things are true, then it should produce real and measurable change in the individual. And if that is true, then spiritual formation deserves as much of a place in the academy as does psychology, sociology, and biology, because you're dealing with knowledge. And he wrote Knowing Christ Today, and his philosophical magnum opus project published after he died, The Disappearance of Moral Knowledge. I'll close with just 2 or 3 slides. At least one of you has been to this restaurant. This is a restaurant not far from Dallas's home called The Lamplighter. He somehow found in Southern California a rural Missouri restaurant, and he went there with thousands of people for conversation. After he had died, and while working on the biography, Regina and I were with Jane and Becky, and we decided to spend the night in town, and we stayed at a hotel not too far from this restaurant. Sitting on the sidewalk, listening to conversations, someone's talking about the lamplighter, and they keep talking about the lamplighter in this restaurant, and they're kind of loud, and I can't help but hear the conversation. And they're claiming that they have a nephew that played in the World Series, and they were there to watch this nephew play in the World Series. And so after a while, I had about enough, and so I said, listen, so the lamplighter, I said, it's a long shot, but have you ever heard about someone who used to go to the lamplighter a lot, Dallas Willard? And the person says, oh, yeah, he was like Norm on Cheers. He was there all the time. At this point, I knew he was lying. So I said, really? Did you have a lot of conversations with him? Just one. 10-minute conversation at the cash register. Really? 25 years ago. And what did you talk about? Oh, metaphysics, theology, becoming like Jesus. So at this point, I realized he's telling the truth. I found out more about his life story. He was a philosophy major in college. He'd been on the board of a church not too far up the street in Pasadena from where Regina and I lived for 6 years. But at this point in his life, he was homeless and living out of his car. But I decided, okay, I bet he can handle Dallas's 4 ideas. So I shared with him Dallas's 4 ideas, and I'm looking down, it's kind of quiet. I look up, and there are tears streaming down his face, and he says something I'll never forget. Where were those 4 ideas when I left the church? Okay. I think Dallas's 4 critical concerns to me are like 4 pillars of integration of psychology, theology, 4 pillars of spiritual formation. Lamplighter was originally part of the title for the book. It didn't make the cut. And I originally had a pretty long preface that was about this painting in Vincent van Gogh that I was quite enamored with, but it didn't make the cut either. But I'll tell you briefly. You know the story. Starry, starry night. Sky is aglow. The town is aglow. There's a light everywhere except one place. It's in the church. So the notion of Dallas as a lamplighter and kind of reestablishing the glow there was kind of a driving factor for me in the biography, as was this. Rublev's icon of the Trinity, the notion of Dallas being the type of person who made you believe that this is actually part of reality, and you're invited to pull up a chair to this table and put your feet in the river of life and listen in on a conversation. Often about how much you're loved, how much you're part of the family. I will close with just a couple of things. A couple of quotes from Dallas and a story, and we're done. For all the talk about transformation, Willard talking, it appears to ordinary Christians today like distant galaxies in the night sky, visible somehow, but inaccessible to the conditions of life as we know them. Hence, you will rarely meet an individual Christian who is seriously engaged in the transformation, spiritual formation depicted in the Bible and church history, or who even has a hope for anything like that this side of heaven. So Willard stepped into that gap. He also Last two things. Willard, the aim of God in human history is the creation of an all-inclusive community of loving persons with himself included in that community as its prime sustainer and most glorious inhabitant. I think I probably should cut the last story so we have more time, right?
It's up to you.
Give me 3 minutes.
Got it.
This will be the concluding story. The biography is written. I'm sitting with Regina at our favorite retreat center, and I hear this. Wednesday, May the 18th, 2016, I was sitting with Regina in our parked car in La Casa de Maria in Santa Barbara. It's a special place for us. It's a sanctuary we've been visiting for more than 3 decades. It's also the place I had said my last goodbye to Dallas Willard, sitting on a wooden bench near the chapel. Regina and I were deep in conversation when a woman about our age came to the driver's side of the car and tapped the window. She wanted to make sure we were not about to back up the car. She explained that she had been bringing her dog to the spot for almost every day for more than a decade. The dog was blind and would not be able to see our car if we moved it. We assured her that we would be parked a long while and would not move without letting her know. Then we went back to our conversation. But after a while, we noticed rhythmic scraping sounds behind us. We were not prepared for what we saw when we turned in our seats. The mid-sized dog had a solid white coat. His eyes seemed blue, but it was hard to tell as they were clouded by blindness. As we watched, the woman ran backwards, making large figure-8 patterns. She was dragging her feet across the pebbles and asphalt as she ran, creating scraping sounds for her dog to hear. The dog had a tennis ball in its mouth and seemed to be laughing with joy as he tried to stay close to her. The woman was smiling back at her companion and saying, "I'm right here. I see you. I've got you." As we watched this graceful movement and loving accommodation, tears began in our eyes, and then I felt like I heard God say something like, "You're the dog. I'm the owner. I know you can't see what is really real and all around you. I know you can't see me, but I have you. I love you. I'll make noises that you can hear. Follow me. I'm right here. I see you. I've got you." Immediately, I thought of the 4 driving concerns of Dallas Willard, his primary message. He came to realize that we live in a world where our owner is real but invisible to our clouded vision. We are blind to his presence, but the King of the Kingdom looks on and smiles and makes accommodations to our ways of sensing his presence and whispers, "I'm right here. I see you. I've got you." Okay, we'll stop with that.
Gary, if I may, you had an inspired topic, but you handled it in an inspired way, so we want to thank you for that. We've got about 20 minutes for Q&A. Just a few hygiene things. We like to get these on tape as well because this has been videotaped, so I will have one microphone, so I'll have to get my exercise for the day and run to you when you want to ask a question. Please make your questions short and make them questions, and so I can get on to the next person as well. We also have a table over there with material from the Areopagus, and included there are a number of still a number of copies of Gary's book. They're $20 a piece, and tonight only they're 2 for $40. Okay. So, and you did have I was afraid we hadn't given you a bottle of water, so at least at least you have a bottle of water. So that's great. So we've got about 20 minutes, and I'm going to do something I've never done before. I'm going to ask the first question. I know of Dallas Willard primarily through contacts, primarily through J.P. Moreland and other places where I've read things in anthologies and so forth. I've never really dived into it, and that obviously from tonight, that's something that's got to be on my bucket list of things to do. Where should one start? I mean, there's numbers of books out there. There's the whole Redefining Institute and so forth, which I find a little overwhelming in some sense. I need to get into it from the point of view of the kinds of questions that you were asking. Those are great questions, and those are things that you could think about and talk about in your own life and talk about with other people, which I think would be great as well. But what's your best route for people into the world of Dallas Willard?
Yeah, several things. two or three or four different approaches. One approach is to start chronologically and begin with Hearing God, originally published as In Search of Guidance, and just move through. And from there, the Divine Conspiracy. That's one approach. Another approach is to start with something that was published after his death, called on the 23rd Psalm, and it is called, Regina, this book. Can we cut the tape? Can we just cut the tape? No, Life Without Lack. Thank you. Because it's from years ago, and it's a simple teaching on the 23rd Psalm, and that's the one where in the center of it is this trust and humility and love. That's
great. Now, questions? Yes, we'll start over here.
In your book on the first 30 years of his life, it appears that much of what you knew about or your perspective of his early life was almost speculative. I mean, and so I was sort of surprised that you or Richard Foster or Jane appeared to know so little about the impact of those early years. So is that, I mean, am I accurate in that? And I'm just wondering, did he really talk much about that, or was he very private? It comes across he was a very private person about his childhood.
Yeah, I didn't start out to write the biography. What we were going to do at the Willard Center was a documentary on Dallas's life. So he did consent to that. And so I had about 150 single-spaced pages of just interviewing him and talking to him. So that's where I first started getting the idea that about this becoming aspect. And there'd just be little hints and so forth. But it was like traveling around talking to people like Bertha and others. I wouldn't say that he was private or secretive exactly. And in fact, in his talks, you see a lot of evidence, like the quote that I read, where sometimes he just says directly, I'm talking about myself. I think it was more he just was very humble and didn't necessarily think people would care that much about his life. He just kind of kept the focus on Jesus instead of his own life. But yeah.
Other questions? You've answered them all.
Oh, cool.
Jeffrey. Oh, Jeffrey always has a question. That's great.
Well, in all of your interaction with Dallas over the years, what was sort of the most memorable encounter for you? Now, this may be the hardest question you've ever been asked.
Yeah, it's like 10 things spring to mind at once. So I'll just maybe go with the first one that gets out. The fact that when he taught in the Redefining Institute and gave a week, he gave his spring and fall break weeks. I mean, he took time away from USC to teach intensely for a week, 4 sessions a day, 45 students, and then he insisted on meeting with them individually, 30 minutes each. So just the generosity of himself to others. Yes.
Richie Willard, no relation to Dallas. But I am interested. So I lived in an intentional Christian community for a year. And we were very focused on cultivating spiritual habits. The hardest was the practice of silence and solitude. So I'm interested in your feedback from Dallas Willard on how he actually went about conducting his daily life to cultivate these habits that are truly transformational once adopted. But if not careful attention is paid, then you kind of live a functional atheistic life, even trying to be a Christian in the modern world.
Yeah, that's a good one too. And that does get, in one of the chapters, that gets about 10 pages of attention. So it's kind of looking at his life that way. He did use solitude. He did consider solitude to be a very foundational discipline. Study was huge. I'll never forget what Jane said after Dallas passed away, basically about his disciplined life. She basically pointed out the worn spot on the sofa and said that's where he is for X number of hours every day, as far as scripture study and memorization and in reading. He would fast. He would sometimes say, be careful with fasting. You might not know what to do with all that energy. What he meant was that if you're truly fasting, and the fast involves a food fast, and then you actually are feasting on the presence of God. He had a serious warning about being careful about burning that kind of energy of fasting. I've never had that experience, but I trust him with it. I'm not sure I'm hitting your questions. He had a teaching series in 1970, a 27-year-old pastor, fresh from a doctoral program at Fuller, went to his first pastorate at a little church in the Simi Valley, about 50 people in the church. Pastor was Richard Foster. He was a little bit surprised by how good the Sunday school lessons were. The Sunday school teacher was Dallas Willard, and like one of the series was on spiritual disciplines. They took a little bit of a different tack. Willard, Foster writes about 12 classic spiritual disciplines, groups them in 3 groups of 4. Dallas talked more about disciplines of abstinence, disciplines of engagement. He was just a big believer in rehabituating ourselves with classic spiritual disciplines for the sake of he might call it trying to remove the automatic responses against the kingdom. What does that mean? My responses without thinking about it, of moving toward willfulness instead of willingness, or moving toward living out of an ego state instead of an other-centered state. But removing the automatic habits that move us away from God or against the kingdom. Yes?
Bill?
So correct me if I'm wrong, but I think I remember from reading the book you said that he would wake up and go get coffee and then have breakfast and then go to his study. And one of the things that impressed me was related to solitude was, again, correct me if I'm wrong, it wasn't like he went on silent retreats or whatever, but he just developed this ability to sit still and reflect.
Yeah.
And that was kind of, to me, that was interesting because it seemed kind of more of a natural orientation toward being quiet and, being able to focus your mind on something in particular. And I think for me, that's one of the things I thought about, in our modern day world. I think it was Pascal who said, or Kierkegaard who said, in the modern world, amusement and entertainment will be like the thing that'll take us most away from the important issues of life. We want to escape from being quiet. But what I got, from reading that was that he had developed that to just be able to focus in that way.
Bill, I'd like to say that you're not wrong. I just want to say that you're not wrong. But it's also a good point. I mean, if you're looking for what was Dallas's favorite retreat center, and how many times a year did he go to a retreat center, you won't find anything. What you'll find instead is him encouraging you to use the solitude moments of life, or he might encourage the students to, why don't you go watch some ducks for a while?
Yeah, that was the other thing you mentioned was, so you used to sit and watch ducks, the ducks at the pond?
Yes, apparently so. Yeah.
So I have a spiritual retreat at home. I live on a lake, so I could watch ducks. That'd be good. That would be good.
But I think that makes a very good point about spiritual disciplines. I don't have a slide for it, but I love a slide that I have that I picked up from, I think, Glandian Carney. He lives in Atlanta. About turning drinking a cup of coffee into a spiritual discipline. I mean, yes, there are these classic patterns and classic things, but there's also turning anything in life into spiritual discipline. So you go to Starbucks and you pick up the coffee and you say to yourself, may the warmth of this coffee remind me of the warmth of your presence in my life. And then you hold it to your lips Well, first you feel the breeze or you see the movement and you say something about the hushness and stillness as a reminder of God. And you take a drink, and as it slides down your throat, you pray, as this coffee, be in me, the center of my life. It's much better on the slide, but you get the idea. It's turning anything into a spiritual discipline.
I love that. I'm a big fan of the natural world, and so I can look out my bedroom window at the trees, and I can look at a twig on a tree and just think, you could cut that off and you could study it for the rest of your life. You know, all of the biology and the botany and everything that needs to come, and where did it come from and what its history was and so forth. I mean, it's just that depth. And yet we go through life with blinders on. You just go through life with blinders on, and we don't see these things, which we should. Who else? We had a couple of minutes left. Yes.
Thank you so much for being here. The previous gentleman's question tagged this thought in my mind that I heard others talk about. Isn't it fascinating that Dallas is so fascinating that so many people talk about him, and we learn so much about him from other people? The spiritual disciplines question. I heard some people talking about how Dallas would talk a lot about self-control, practicing self-control, even to the point if you had an itch or something, just to ignore it or to make your way through it. And that could apply to so many things. Can you touch on your experience with Dallas regarding self-control and some of those things? It may morph into what you had just said.
Yes, that's. I wish I had that example when I was writing the biography. I don't remember that specific thing, but it also sounds like Dallas, so I certainly don't doubt it. I wouldn't think he was saying anything more necessarily than I don't have to act on what I'm next inclined to do. Not that there's any virtue in not acting on it, but there's virtue in the freedom of I don't have to follow this pattern. It's typical, it's ingrained pattern. I don't have to follow it. Yes.
Yes, Robbie.
While we're transitioning, I'll just say quickly on spiritual disciplines, this is more from me, from Dallas, but I do think I got everything from him. I like to talk about spiritual disciplines at 3 different levels. One level is just to demystify them, and so I might ask people to think about what are 10 things that you might do on a date that doesn't cost more than $10, but it enhances your sense of being with the person that you're with. And so they come up with a list and say, okay, that's like a spiritual discipline. Anything that I do that's available that enhances the sense of witness or enhances a sense of awareness. Okay, great, that's spiritual discipline. Second thing, you might ask somebody, I think I saw Jamie K.A. Smith do this, but you might ask a group, where's the letter S on your keyboard? And most people show you with their left finger. Why? Because that is it inhabits them now. It's in their body. So spiritual disciplines are also trying to embody things where my automatic response is not movement away from God, but movement toward, or movement out of awareness, or movement into more awareness. And then the last thing is more prescriptively, so a discipline used as a specific way of trying to combat known negative habit patterns with better habit patterns. Like I might practice a discipline of silence, not because there's virtue in not speaking, because I've noticed that I'm constantly using words to manipulate other people's opinion of me. So maybe it's good to stop that for a week. Okay, sorry.
Dallas Willard had so many wise sayings and memorable quotes. Have you ever thought about publishing a book of Willardisms?
Yeah, I think, not me personally, but I think Elaine O'Rourke did a Dallas dictionary, and John Ortberg keeps talking or thinking about maybe something like that, but I think that's a very good idea.
I remember one, there's many, but one that just stands out where he said, the Christian burns grace like a 747 burns fuel.
That and to understand that, I think is huge for getting Dallas. Does everybody get that? Like he would say, who needs more grace, a sinner or a saint? And most people blurt out sinner. And he says, no, a sinner just needs a very little bit of grace and it's available to them. But if grace is acting with God in your life, it's the saint that's burning grace. It's burning through that interactive relationship.
We're just about the end. I'm just wondering of modern writers, and there are many, and of all different sort of stripes and so forth, are there any that you feel are most in the tradition of Dallas Willard, who might be in a position to sort of carry on that kind of tradition?
I would tell you, but it's being recorded, so I'm afraid I'd leave somebody out. That's
Okay.
different. But no, they're just it's remarkable the number of people he's inspired, and I think I'd pull something together where I think I got up over 100 books or so that kind of people that are attributing to Dallas and writing books in spiritual formation. Obviously, Foster and Ortberg and Jan Johnson are three obvious ones, but there's just dozens of people.
Will you be able to hang out for a while to interact with people on an individual
Sure.
basis, right? Well, show our appreciation to Gary. That was great. Don't forget to visit the resource table over there. You can also sign up if you're not on the email distribution list of the Areopagus. We'd love to be in touch with you and let you know other events that are coming up in the future.